The cold wind tore across the frozen plains of Ikara 9, biting at every exposed piece of skin. Snow swirled in thick clouds, and jagged ice formations jutted up from the ground like the teeth of some ancient beast. In the distance, a small figure stumbled through the storm, collapsing every few steps. Not far behind, another figure struggled to support them, while a small, fragile creature clung to their legs, crying softly. They were alone. Starving. Every muscle ached, and each breath felt heavier than the last. Their ship had been destroyed by raiders from the neighboring system, leaving them stranded on this frozen world. They had no food, no warmth, and no hope, at least none that they could see. The cold was merciless, and it seemed to swallow their very spirits. But somewhere high above the planet, a human explorer watched. Ethan had been scanning the terrain for rare minerals, something to trade back at the station. He had visited dangerous planets before, but this one felt empty, silent. Until his sensors picked up a faint distress signal, a weak, erratic transmission that could have easily been dismissed as interference. Most explorers would have ignored it. Most would have flown past, leaving the signal to fade into nothing. But Ethan had always been different. He didn't ignore cries for help, even if they came from the strangest, most distant corners of space. He guided his small shuttle down through the icy clouds, landing carefully on a patch of flat ice. The engines hummed low, vibrating against the ground. The door opened, and he stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him instantly, but he barely noticed. He had survived worse. He tightened his thermal jacket and followed the signal. When he found them, his stomach tightened. 2 adults and a child, alien but clearly intelligent, lay on the snow shivering violently. Their skin was pale with cold, their eyes glassy from exhaustion. The child whimpered, clutching a piece of tattered cloth while the adults struggled to rise. They saw him, and for a moment their fear was palpable. They had no reason to trust him. After everything they had endured, trust was a luxury they could not afford. Ethan didn't rush. He lowered himself slowly, keeping his hands visible, showing he meant no harm. "I'm here to help," he said softly, hoping they understood. He reached into his pack and pulled out a thermal blanket, laying it over the child first. The warmth seemed to shock the little one, who looked at him with wide eyes but didn't recoil. The adults groaned but couldn't move quickly enough to take the blanket. Ethan placed it gently over them too. He offered water and small rations from his pack. At first they hesitated. The hunger in their eyes fought with their caution, but the smell of warm food and the promise of relief was too strong to resist. Slowly, they took the food, tasting it like they had never eaten before. Ethan worked carefully, checking for injuries. He was not a doctor, but he had basic medical training. He cleaned small cuts, wrapped bruises, and used makeshift splints for twisted limbs. The aliens winced but didn't resist. They were too weak to fight, and too desperate to care about pride. As the storm raged around them, they huddled together in the small shelter Ethan had built from his shuttle's supplies. He had improvised walls of metal panels, insulating them as best he could from the relentless wind. He started a small heater, the orange glow casting shadows across the ice. For the first time in days, the aliens could feel warmth. The child, no older than 6 in human years, crawled toward him hesitantly. Its small, translucent hands reached out, then recoiled. Ethan smiled gently. "It's okay. You're safe." He extended a hand, and after a moment's hesitation, the child took it. The connection was simple, wordless, but powerful. It was trust, fragile and tentative, forming in the middle of a frozen wasteland. The adults observed silently. They were wary, and understandably so. They had seen too many strangers betray them, too many humans and other species take advantage of their weakness. But they also saw how Ethan cared for the child, how he worked tirelessly without complaint, and a spark of hope began to grow. Perhaps they thought not all humans were dangerous. Perhaps some could be allies. Night fell and the storm worsened. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the shelter and blowing snow through the cracks. Ethan stayed awake, watching the aliens sleep, making sure they were safe. He knew the night could be deadly. Temperatures on Ikara 9 dropped quickly, and even a few hours without warmth could mean death. As he sat there, he thought about the stories humans told themselves, the stories of survival, courage, and compassion. He never considered them just tales. Humans were survivors not because they were the strongest, but because they refused to give up on others. It was that refusal that set them apart. And now, in the middle of a frozen world, with creatures who were not human but not entirely alien to empathy, That refusal drove him forward. When the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the storm began to ease. Ethan roused the adults and helped them to their feet. The child clung to him, refusing to let go. He smiled, lifting the little one gently. "We'll find food. We'll find warmth. And we'll get off this planet," he promised, and for the first time, the aliens dared to hope that those words could be true. He led them toward a nearby ridge, where he had spotted a cavern system during his descent. The caverns were small and rocky, but they would provide shelter from the wind and a place to rest. Along the way, he kept an eye on the surroundings. Danger was never far away, and the ice plains of Ikara 9 were filled with hidden hazards. Creatures adapted to the cold, thin ice that could give way, and sudden snowslides. But Ethan moved with confidence and care, guiding the aliens safely. Inside the cavern, he built a fire using fuel from his shuttle. The glow was comforting, the warmth spreading slowly through the rocks. The aliens gathered close, shivering but alive. For the first time in days, they felt some semblance of safety. They ate the food Ethan had brought, and the child laughed softly at a trick he performed with a small flame, flicking it between his fingers. The sound was fragile but magical, a reminder that life persisted even in the harshest conditions. As night fell again, Ethan sat outside the cavern entrance, keeping watch. He thought about their situation. They were far from home, stranded on a frozen world with no immediate way of contacting the wider universe. Rescue could take days or longer. But he also knew something else. Humans were not just survivors, they were problem solvers. If there was a way to save these aliens, he would find it. He had to. Inside the cavern, the adults whispered to each other in their own language. Words were exchanged in hushed tones, full of caution and curiosity. They did not yet fully understand Ethan, but they could sense his determination. There was no malice in his actions, no hidden agenda, and that was rare. That was worth trust. For hours, Ethan remained awake, eyes scanning the icy plains. He noticed the faint glow of distant stars, and for a moment he imagined a universe where humans and aliens could help each other, where differences were not barriers, but bridges. He made a silent promise to himself and to these fragile beings before him. They would survive. Together they would endure this planet, and someday they would find safety beyond it. The storm began to abate, leaving a crisp, cold clarity in the air. Ethan returned inside the cavern, sitting beside the child. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we start moving. Slowly, carefully, but we move, and we will survive." The child nodded, eyes wide, a tiny hand clutching his. The adults watched silently, a mixture of caution and hope in their expressions. Outside, the frozen plains of Ikara 9 stretched endlessly. But inside that small cavern, there was warmth, food, and the flicker of trust. And for the first time in a long while, survival seemed possible. Ethan knew the journey would be long and danger would not be far behind. But as he looked at the fragile group huddled together, he understood something vital. Humans did not survive alone. They survived by protecting others, by risking themselves for those who could not fight. That was what made them formidable. That was what made them human. And for these aliens who had known nothing but fear and hunger, that human courage was about to become their lifeline. The morning sun broke across the icy plains of Ikara 9, casting pale light over the frozen landscape. Inside the cavern, Ethan stirred the fire to life. The aliens, now more alert than yesterday, sat close to the warmth. The child yawned, rubbing its eyes, and for the first time in days a small smile played on its lips. Ethan handed a piece of food to the child, who accepted it eagerly. The adults watched silently, their expressions unreadable, but Ethan could see the tension in their shoulders easing slightly. He had a plan. The cavern was safe for now, but they could not stay here forever. The hostile fleet that had destroyed their ship might still be in the system, and the planet offered no long-term refuge. They needed to move, to find a place where they could survive and perhaps call for help. But the journey would be difficult. The ice plains stretched for miles and food was scarce. Ethan had to be careful, for one wrong step could cost them everything. He spoke softly, trying to make himself understood. Words were limited. The aliens had no shared language with humans, and he knew their communication would be slow. But gestures, drawings in the snow, and patient repetition began to bridge the gap. He showed them a map of the nearby terrain, pointing to ridges, caves, and potential hazards. The adults watched intently, nodding when they understood, shaking their heads when they did not. The child giggled at the drawings, tracing them with small fingers, eager to learn. They began moving cautiously, the child held in Ethan's arms for safety. Every step was slow, deliberate. The wind whipped across the plains, and snow crunched beneath their feet. Ethan kept his senses alert, scanning for hidden dangers. Small predators lived in these plains, creatures adapted to the cold and able to strike without warning. But Ethan was ready. His instincts, honed over years of exploring dangerous planets, guided them safely through the terrain. As they moved, the aliens began to regain strength. The adults, once weak and trembling, now walked with more confidence, supporting each other when the snow became difficult to cross. The child's laughter echoed faintly in the distance, a sound so rare and beautiful that it lifted Ethan's spirits. He realized that hope once lost could return even in the bleakest conditions. By midday, they reached a ridge overlooking a valley. The view was breathtaking and dangerous at the same time. Ice cliffs plunged into the depths below, and the wind roared through the chasm. Ethan signaled them to stay back, and he crawled forward to survey the path. He spotted a hidden crevice that led down safely, offering a potential route to more sheltered areas. "Follow me," he motioned. The adults hesitated but trusted him enough to obey. The child clung to his jacket, wide-eyed but smiling. One by one, they carefully descended the crevice, Ethan guiding each step. It was slow work, and the wind made it treacherous, but they moved as a unit, relying on each other. Once in the valley, they found a small stream, partially frozen but flowing enough to provide fresh water. Ethan melted some ice to make it safer to drink, and they all drank eagerly. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, but the small rations he had rationed out for 2 days held them together. It was not much, but it was enough to keep them moving. They spent the afternoon resting, hiding from the cold wind, and Ethan took the opportunity to repair his shuttle's distress beacon. If they could survive long enough, he would try to signal the human exploration fleet. The aliens watched curiously, asking questions in their own language. Ethan explained as best as he could with gestures and simple words, showing the beacon and pointing to the sky. Slowly, comprehension dawned. They began to understand that help might come, but only if they survived the days ahead. Night came quickly, in the frozen world, bringing with it deeper cold and eerie shadows. Ethan insisted they stay near the stream, where he could light a controlled fire. The adults gathered rocks to shield the flames from the wind, while the child curled up close to Ethan. He wrapped a blanket around the three of them, and for a few hours the storm outside felt distant. In the quiet moments, Ethan noticed the change in the aliens. The adults, who had barely spoken yesterday, now asked questions in halting tones. They inquired about his life, his home, and even how humans survived in space. He answered as best he could, telling them about distant worlds, exploration, and the human belief in helping others. The child listened closely, eyes wide with fascination. It laughed at his stories, pointing at his hands or mimicking his gestures. By the third day, their strength had improved significantly. The adults walked taller, their movements more assured. They scavenged for small edible plants near the stream, something Ethan had not noticed at first. It was a small victory, but in the harshness of Ikara 9, every small victory mattered. But danger was never far. As they rested near a rocky outcrop, Ethan noticed movement across the valley. Using his binoculars, he identified the remnants of the Raider fleet's ground patrols, scouts looking for survivors. They had not left the system entirely, and the aliens' sense of fear returned instantly. Ethan had anticipated this possibility. He knew that hiding would only buy them time. They had to act, and they had to be smart. He led the group into a narrow canyon, where the cliffs rose high, and the path was difficult for outsiders to navigate. Here, he could use the terrain to his advantage. He set simple traps using rocks and snow to create false paths, slowing down any pursuers. The aliens watched, learning quickly. They began to understand the logic of survival, the strategy of outsmarting a stronger enemy. It was not brute force. It was intelligence, patience, and courage. Night fell again, colder than before, and Ethan prepared for the worst. He reinforced their shelter and kept watch, listening to the faint sounds of wind and distant metal scraping on ice. Hours passed. The scouts did not appear, but the tension remained. Every noise made the aliens flinch, and Ethan realized that fear could be both a weakness and a teacher. He had to show them that courage did not mean absence of fear. It meant acting despite it. The following morning, Ethan made a decision. They could not stay in one place for long. He needed to move them to the shuttle, which he had hidden under a small overhang far from their path. It was risky. If the scouts found them en route, they could be trapped. But he also knew that humans were capable of extraordinary planning under pressure. He calculated a route that took advantage of shadows, terrain, and timing, then explained it with careful gestures. The journey was tense. The child clung to him, the adults followed closely, and Ethan led them with careful steps. Every crack of ice, every distant howl of wind, felt amplified. And then, as they approached the hidden shuttle, the scouts appeared. There were 3 of them, heavily armored, moving with mechanical precision. Ethan acted quickly. He used the terrain to his advantage, guiding the group along a narrow ledge where the scouts could not follow. He triggered small traps he had set earlier, rocks falling to block paths, snow slides that forced the scouts to retreat. The aliens watched in awe as the human moved with precision, courage, and cunning. It was a display of intelligence and bravery they had never seen before. When they finally reached the shuttle, Ethan worked rapidly to start the engines. The aliens helped as much as they could, moving cargo, assisting with small controls under his guidance. The scouts attempted to pursue, but the shuttle lifted off just as they reached the edge of the ridge. Ethan piloted with skill, weaving through ice formations and using the shuttle's agility to avoid detection. The aliens clutched at the seats, awe and relief written across their faces. Once safely away from the planet, Ethan set a course for a nearby human outpost. The aliens, exhausted but alive, began to relax. The child fell asleep in his arms, a soft, peaceful breathing that contrasted sharply with the fear and pain of days past. The adults exchanged glances, and then slowly they nodded at Ethan, a silent gesture of trust and gratitude. During the journey, Ethan reflected on what had happened. Humans had survived not because of strength alone, but because of courage, empathy, and ingenuity. He had seen it in countless explorations, but this was different. These aliens, once starving and alone, now lived because a human had refused to leave them behind. The bond formed here in the harshest of conditions would last far beyond this planet. The shuttle arrived at the outpost, where medical teams and supplies awaited. The aliens were helped out, receiving proper care, food, and shelter. Ethan watched from a distance, feeling a deep satisfaction. They were safe now, but more importantly, they had hope. Hope that humans could be allies, protectors, and friends. The child waved at him before disappearing into the care of medical staff. Ethan smiled, waving back. The adults nodded once more, their eyes filled with gratitude. And for the first time in days, Ethan felt the quiet joy of knowing that he had made a difference. Above all, he understood something essential about humanity. They were survivors, not because they were the strongest or fastest, but because they cared enough to act when others could not. That simple, powerful courage had saved lives today, and would continue to save lives across the stars. And as Ethan prepared for his next mission, he knew that the bond he had formed on Ikara 9 was a reminder of what humans could be at their best, protectors, guides, and friends to those in need, no matter how alien, distant, or different.